Good afternoon, everyone. So as you already know, we're going to talk about some paradoxes today. And in particular, I would like to point out some of the uses of these paradoxes that sometimes they can be really good, all right? Although usually we are kind of shocked when we encounter a paradox. Sometimes they have good uses. So let's just agree on some terms before we begin. So whenever I will use the word statement, I'm referring to a sentence that denotes some entity of which it makes sense to have certain attitudes towards it. In particular, those attitudes are things like knowing, believing, denying, asserting, and other things. Those entities, sometimes people call them propositions, all right? So not important what really they are, but it's just that statements denote those kinds of objects. And if we assume classical logic, and I will not get into details about what that really means exactly, but if we assume classical logic, then there is an easier way to characterize what a statement is. A statement would be a sentence of which it makes sense to say that it's true or false. A sentence, we agree that you can assign it a truth value, all right? And here are some examples of statements. So water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Is this a statement? Yes, all right? Totally okay statement because it would make sense to say this is true or this is false. It's actually true. Okay. Whales or fish? Statement? Sure. La wallahi statement, right? No, why not? Yeah, it's a false statement, but it's a statement. Statements can be false, right? There is a man with a red cloak outside H2. Statement? No? Wallahi, we don't know, right? Can you please check? But probably there is nobody with a red cloak outside H2, right? Why isn't it a statement? Because we don't know, right? Yeah, but that's irrelevant. So it's not about what we know. It's about whether it's really true or false. It makes sense to say, yeah, that is either true or false, right? Our ignorance has nothing to do with the story, okay? Now, there could be issues here because that third example, yes, I think it's a statement, but its meaning depends on when you say it, right? Actually, whether it's true or false depends on when you say it, unlike the first two. So water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. This is kind of eternal, right? It's either true or false whenever you say it, and same thing for whales or fish. However, that other statement contains an element of context. So the things that those statements really denote, those propositions, you really get at them when you include with you in the interpretation all the elements of context. So you really need to know when the statement is being said, who's saying it and to whom, and things like that. There are statements that are really strange, like, I am not here now. Is that a statement? It's weird. It's a weird kind of statement, right? It's obvious what that would mean, but you really need to know who's saying it, when and where, and then usually here is not referring to the location of the speaker. It's referring to the location where you see the note, for example. All right? So what are examples of things of sentences which are not statements then? Things like, are whales fish? This is not a statement, right? Or please go get somebody with a red cloak. That's not a statement either, right? It wouldn't make sense to say that it's true or false. Okay. Agreed. Now, contradictions are false statements. But they are not just false. They don't just happen to be false, like whales or fish, for example. It just happens to be false, all right? They are necessarily false. Now, what do we mean by this? intuitively, we mean that the falsity of a contradiction is kind of resilient to all possible logical perturbations of the world. Meaning, if you change the world while remaining logical, right, it should still be false. So whales or fish is not a contradiction because you can't change the world, you can't change the way we use terms, for example, or even change biology so that the things that we call whales are indeed fish. All right? This is not a contradiction for that reason. So what is an example of a contradiction? Very silly statements. Like, for example, whales are fish and whales are not fish. That can never be true, regardless of what whales means, what fish means, right? And when you're saying it, for example, and who's saying it. It can never be true. This is false no matter what, all right? In all of those other logically possible alternatives of reality, this is a false statement. That makes it a contradiction, all right? So, a paradox is also a contradiction, but it's an interesting one, unlike the silly statement that we saw on the previous slide. It's actually usually a surprising contradiction. You are kind of shocked when you discover that it's contradictory because you never expect it from that kind of statement. And the reason is that paradoxes usually rest upon very sharp intuitions that we have about things. So we start from very simple intuitions, which we kind of never question, and then we discover that they lead to a contradiction, okay? So the problem when you discover a contradiction is that you really do not know what went wrong, right? Which is not the case with whales are fish and whales are not fish. You know what went wrong. You conjoined a statement together with its negation, right? You deliberately made something that will result in a contradiction. But the kinds of paradoxes that we will see are not like that. And they really make us stop and think about our sanity, right? Our intuitions, whether we really have the right intuitions regarding very important things or not. So this is what we will be doing. We will be, how will this work? Okay. I will first be kind of going over some famous paradoxes. You've probably seen some of them. Maybe some are new. And this is not an exhaustive list, of course, because there are surprisingly lots of paradoxes out there. Because if you know the trick, you can make up your favorite paradox after that, all right? So the first one is the one in the cartoon that the guys posted. It's about a barber, or the existence of a barber, right? So the statement says, there is a male barber. He has to be a male barber, right? Otherwise, you won't get a paradox. There's a male barber who shaves exactly those men who do not shave themselves. Yeah, what's wrong with that? Now, you guys are sophisticated, so you know what's wrong. But anybody who sees this for the first time will think, yeah, sure. So this does not seem contradictory on the first pass when you just look at it without really giving it a second thought. And by the way, on a side note, if this barber exists, then everybody's shaved, right? صح ولا لا? Because either you shave yourself or the barber will come for you, right? The barber will take care of you, will shave you, okay? So all men are shaved if this barber does exist. But here is the problem. Now we ask, does the barber shave himself? The barber is a man, right? And that's very important. The barber is a man. So you have two answers. Does the barber shave himself? Again, assuming this classical logic, whatever it means, the answer is either yes or no, right? You shouldn't say maybe or sometimes or things like that, right? You need to have a definite answer. And if you think that, of course you would say, I have no idea. I've never seen that barber, right? So yeah, but the possible answers are yes or no. And you just need to consider what will happen if the answer is either one of these. So if the answer is yes, then what you're really saying is the barber shaves himself. So therefore, he's not one of those men who do not shave themselves, right? But that's outside the scope of the barber. So he shouldn't be shaving himself, right? So the answer cannot be yes. Then the only other logical possibility is a no. And then if the answer is a no, then no means the barber does not shave himself, but then he's within the set of men that the barber is supposed to shave, so he must be shaving himself, right? So what do? He cannot exist. Right? There is no such barber, right? Cannot happen. Here's another famous example. This is called the liar sentence. It says, this sentence is false, okay? And it classically has the name L. So now we ask ourselves, is L true? Now, this is a statement or not? Syntactically, it looks like English statements, like a declarative sentence. Of course, some people argue that the problems caused by this can be kind of circumvented if we assume that it's not a statement. And some people actually say that. This is not a statement. That's one answer, right? And therefore, it wouldn't make sense to ask whether it's true or false. But intuitively, we should, right? So if the answer is yes, L is true, then what it is saying is the case. But what is it saying? It is false. Now, in classical logic, this cannot happen. A statement cannot both be true and false. So it must be that L is false then. Yep. But if L is false, then what L is saying is not the case, right? And therefore, it must be that it is not false and hence true, right? So it doesn't look like it could be either way, right? So now, if you think that you might get around this by saying, yeah, but you're assuming classical logic. You're assuming that the only truth values are true and false. What if there are things that can be neither? For example, yeah, somebody said, yeah, all right, nice try, but we can change L so that it says this sentence is not true. Then if it is true, then it is not true, right? And if it is not true, whatever the truth value is, right, then it is true, yeah? If true keeps its meaning, if true lives up to its meaning, all right, then this wouldn't do. Now, some people actually, there is a long history of attempts to try to kind of explain the paradox, and people were trying to get around it at the beginning. And some people tried to say, okay, now there's a problem with this construction, because the statement refers to itself, right, in a kind of a funny way. It's not really saying anything about anything, just saying, I'm not true. What does that mean? So Saul Kripke said that he had a long article in which he's proposing a solution to the liar paradox. But he started by saying that you really cannot attribute the paradox to any property of the sentence itself. It's not about the sentence. I can give you a totally innocent sentence, and it will result in a similar paradox. And here is an example in his paper. By the way, that was written in 1975, and you will see why this example was good at the time. So Jones says, most of Nixon's utterances about Watergate are false. All right? Nixon says, all of Jones's utterances about Watergate are true. Fair enough? Is there anything paradoxical going on here? Is there anything funny? Is there this sentence, right? These are totally good sentences, and they are informative, right? In at least some contexts. But then, the fact of the matter can make them paradoxical, all right? How's that? Now, imagine if Jones's only statement about Watergate is this one. The guy said nothing about Watergate except that most of Nixon's utterances about Watergate are false. And imagine that Nixon made an odd number of statements about Watergate. All right? Let's say 101. 50 of them are true and 50 are false, and this one over here is the 101. All right? So let's think about this. What about Jones's utterance? Is it true? Well, it is true or false, because that's a statement, right? Suppose Jones's utterance is true. Then what is it saying? It's saying that most of Nixon's utterances are false. Now, for this to happen, this particular utterance must be false then, right? But if that one is false, then everything that Jones said about Watergate is true, and everything is just that single statement, right? So, okay? Yeah? What is this? Most of it, I don't know. Ah, this one is false, and then it is saying that the first one is true, then it cannot be true, right? That's contradiction. So maybe Jones's utterance is false. But if Jones's utterance is false, then most of Nixon's utterances must be true, which would make that utterance of Nixon true. But if it's true, then the only thing that Jones ever said about Watergate must be true, not false. Yeah? It's starting to get a little bit tricky, okay? So the problem here, the point of this example is that it's not about the construction, it's not about the liar sentence being something that has no significance outside philosophy, right? These are totally fine sentences that people can say. And it just becomes paradoxical as a result of some facts of the world. Okay. More about this. So, there's something called Yablo's paradox. And Yablo's paradox has a sequence of statements, none of which refers to itself, unlike L, which refers to itself directly. So, the first statement says, for every following statement, the statement is false. All the next statements are false. And statement 2 says, all the next statements are false. And statement 3 says, all the next statements are false. You get the point, right? Okay. Now, if any of those statements is true, let's say statement N, okay? If statement N is true, now what would statement N say? Everything after me is false. Wouldn't statement N plus 1 also be true? Because everything after N is also, or includes, everything after N plus 1. So statement N plus 1 would also be true, right? But that would make statement N false. So, because among the things that statement N says is that the very next statement is false, right? So it cannot be that any of those is a true statement then. None of them can be true. But if all of them are false, then all of them are true. All of them are saying the truth, right? If all of them are false, then anyone that says everything after me is false, yeah, that's indeed the case. Because everybody's false, right? Sorry? Yeah, but we agreed that none of them can be true. Sorry? Well, again, all right? If any of them is true, so if Sn is true, then Sn plus 1 is true. Because Sn says everything after me is false. And Sn plus 1 says everything starting from Sn plus 2 is false. But starting from Sn plus 2, these are some of the statements after statement N. So yes, indeed, they are false. So statement n plus 1 is also true. But statement n says that statement n plus 1 is false. So if it's true, that would be a contradiction. So none of the statements can be true, right? Yeah, 2 quizzes on, yeah, okay, on the same day with مفيش actual statement, it's an infinite sequence. That's the point, right? So if none of them is a true statement, then all of them are false. Everybody is false. So what about S1? Is it true or not? Well, we said it is false, right? Everybody is false. But now if you look at what S1 is saying, it is saying the truth. So it must be true, right? Yeah? Okay. So what does this mean, guys? If you think about the consequences of this, we're really kind of not very pleasant. Okay. There is also the infamous Russell's paradox. So suppose that we just assume what is called the classical comprehension axiom about sets. And this is basically the axiom. So what's an axiom about sets? It's just something that we think is intuitive about sets, okay? So the classical comprehension axiom says that given any property P, all right, any well-defined property P, there is a set, and I'm calling it here P between those double square brackets, which is the set of all things of which P is true. All things that have property P, right? So give me your favorite property. What's your favorite property? Being sleepy for, not you, right? It's my favorite property, being sleepy, right? So there is the set of all those things which are sleepy. Property of, what? What infinite? Being infinite, what are you, a number or a set? Okay, the property that is true of all infinite sets. So if that's a property that we can think of, then there is a set of all infinite sets. Okay? Fair enough? So it's an intuitive thing, right? That whichever property you can imagine, there corresponds a set containing all the things that have the property. All right? Now, Bertrand Russell was clever, and he said, yeah, but here you are. Here's a property. Let's call it D. And D is true of X if X is a set that does not belong to itself. Okay? This is actually an easy thing to imagine, that a set does not belong to itself. What is hard to imagine is a set that belongs to itself, maybe, right? A set which is not a member of itself. Are there sets that belong to themselves? Yes. The set of all infinite sets. Can you imagine the set of all infinite sets? What are members of that set? All infinite sets. Is that set infinite? Yeah, because there are infinitely many infinite sets, so it's a member of itself. It's totally fine, right? Not fine, but it can happen. I'm sorry. It can happen, okay? But this is fine, that a set does not belong to itself. Most sets that we encountered are like that, all right? So, then, given the comprehension axiom, then there is this set which contains all sets that do not belong to themselves, right? But then Russell asked, yeah, does D belong to D? D is a set, right? So it's either a member of itself or not. Now let's try to think. The answer is either yes or no. If the answer is yes, then this set D is one of those X's. But then those X's are exactly those sets that are not members of themselves. So, So it cannot be contradiction. So if D is a member of itself, then it's not, right? Then it cannot be a member of itself. But then if D is not a member of itself, then it is one of those X's that are not members of themselves, and then it's a member of itself, right? So therefore, something funny is going on, right? Yeah, the culprit, of course, is this axiom, right? This axiom, while it looks intuitive, maybe there is something wrong about it. Maybe we shouldn't be so permissive. Okay? Here's a paradox from game theory. It's called the hypergame paradox. Now, we say that a game is well-founded, or a well-founded game is a two-player game which is bound to terminate. So after playing some finitely many alternating moves, we halt, we stop. The game has an end. We cannot keep on playing forever. Okay? So hypergame is a game. How is it played? It's a two-player game. Player one, the first move for player one is to choose a well-founded game. So chess, for example. And then the reply by player two is to play the first move of the chosen game. And then player one will play the second move, and so on. Fair enough? Now, because player one is only allowed to choose well-founded games, then starting from step two, from the first move of the second player, we have finitely many moves, right? Because any well-founded game is bound to terminate. Then hypergame is well-founded, right? No, it's not. Well, why not? What do you do when you play hypergame? Yeah, you choose once. Player one's first move is to choose a well-founded game, and then they play the game, starting with player two. Best, right? So this is well-founded. But then you know what will happen, huh? Yeah. What if player one chooses what? Out of all the well-founded games, hypergame, all right, for their first move. Then player two should play the first move of hypergame, which is what? Choose a well-founded game. They choose hypergame again. Then player one plays the first move of hypergame, which is choose hypergame, all right? Will this ever stop? Then it's not well-founded, which is a paradox, right? Because we just proved that it is. Okay. Now, this is something from epistemology. It's called the paradox of the knower. And it's about a statement that says, it's like the liar paradox, but rather than being ontological about truth, it's epistemological about knowledge. So the statement says, this sentence is not known by anyone. Okay? I have no idea who said that sentence. Please don't ask me. But it's a possible sentence, right? Okay. Now let's ask ourselves, because it's a statement, it is either true or false. Can it be false? Let's see. Now this is not straightforward. Suppose it is false. Suppose that K, the knower sentence, is false. Then what it is saying is not the case. That is, somebody knows K. Yeah? Must be somebody knows K for K to be false. Now, in the analysis of knowledge and philosophy, to say that you know a sentence or you know S, it must be that S is true. Right? So I say, for example, I know that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. It means, among other things, that I believe it and that it is true. If I tell you, I know that whales are fish, what would you say about me? Well, either he doesn't know what he's talking about or he doesn't know what knows means, right? Because to say no, it needs to be true, all right? I may believe it. I may be misguided, right? But from a third-person perspective, you're always evaluating things. Yeah, from your opinion, if I would say I know something, you should think that it is true, all right? So if somebody knows K, then K must be true because somebody knows it. Nobody knows false sentences. But if K is true, right, then we have a contradiction because we started assuming that K is false, right? If it is false, then someone knows it, then by the principles of knowledge, it is true. So therefore, it cannot be false. So it must be that K is a true statement, right? صح ولا لا? Now, this reasoning that we just made together, any rational reasoner can replicate it, right? Any person who reasons rationally can reach the same conclusion that K cannot be false, but then if they reach it, they would know K. Because they would believe it justifiably, and it is a true statement. But then if they know K, once they know it, it becomes false. Right? Yes, sir? No, not exactly. Yeah. No. Because knowledge is not just truth. Knowledge is a bunch of things. So to know a sentence, it has to be true. You have to believe it. You need to be justified in believing it and lots of other conditions. So if it's not known by somebody, it doesn't mean that it's false. All right? So long time ago, it was not known that the Earth is spheroid. Not because that is false, but because nobody believed it. Okay? Yeah. Okay. So what do we learn when we look at all of these examples? Well, after getting over the kind of complications of understanding some of them, we really know that our intuitions are misguided. There's something wrong. There are things that we think are just unquestionable, and they really are questionable. And there are things really about very fundamental concepts, like truth. For example, we really do not understand what truth means. Right? So there are theories that try to explain things like the liar paradox, lots of approaches, but none of them is the absolute winner at this point. And we really do not understand exactly what a set is. There have been, of course, revisions of the axioms of set theory, but this is at least what it tells us about naive set theory that we had before. And we have no firm grasp on what knowledge really means. So these paradoxes are good for this. They make us learn that we need to do more work in order to understand some of these things. But what people try to do is that they notice that there are patterns among all these paradoxes. And there are several attempts to try to find those common patterns. I would just mention one of them, one such way to see how these things are related. Let's start with an exercise that could be unrelated to paradox per se. So suppose you have 10 numbers, right, in the rows, each of them consisting of 10 digits. Can you construct a 10-digit number which is different from all of them? Sure, we can. That's easy, right? But let's do it in a kind of a clever way. How? We want to make sure that the number that we will construct is different from each one of those. So we will basically pick a number which differs from each of those 10 in one digit. Now, in particular, we will change the first digit of the first number and the second digit of the second number, and in general, the nth digit of the nth number. we are guaranteed to find something which is different from all of them, right? So if you think of this as a table or a matrix, what are we doing is that we're changing the elements on the diagonal. And then you get the new number 5, 1, 7, 0, 0, 3, 3, 2, 1, 2, which is different from all the 10. All right? This is something easy. But then this exercise actually has a general result behind it. And the result says that for all functions f that take pairs of elements from a set A to a set B, and B needs to have at least 2 members, all right? Because otherwise, f is just a constant function. There is a function g from A to B. Just takes one element of A, maps it to an element of B, such that given any n in A, the function g is not the same as the function that you get if you fix the first argument of f to n and vary the second. Right? What does this have to do with anything? If you look at this table over here, now imagine that the set A is just the set of natural numbers from 1 to 10, okay? And therefore, each row here corresponds to a member of A. And each column also corresponds to a member of A. And then the entries in each of those cells is f of the row number and the column number. Okay? Right? That's the intuition. So f is that function that maps row number I and column number j to the value in their intersection. Then what the theorem is really saying is that there is a function, okay, that would take those column labels, which are elements of A, all right, and map each one of them to something so that this function is not identical to any of the rows of F, right? Which is what we wanted to do here. Get that, right? So G is a function that would take a column label, which is a member of A, and gives us some number. So you can think about it as similar to any of those rows. Each row is a function that takes a column label and maps it into a digit between 0 and 9. All right? So what the theorem says is, now given that big matrix F, you can construct a row which does not belong to F. Okay? That's what it means. So in particular, in our example, as we said, A is the natural numbers from 1 to 10. B is the numbers from 0 to 9. And F is, F of n and m, basically is the mth digit of the nth number, right? Given that we thought of those rows as representing numbers. And G of m does what? Now, the particular G that we construct, the particular number that we constructed, it takes a diagonal element, f of m and m, and just adds 1 modulo 10. The remainder of dividing that by 10. Okay? Now, this is really interesting, and we can apply it to other situations. So let's go back to the barber. Remember, the barber statement said, there is a male barber who shaves exactly those men who do not shave themselves. Now consider the set A to be the set of all men, all right, regardless of the shaving situation, all men. And B to be a set containing 0 and 1, only 2 elements. And define a function f over pairs of men so that f of x and y is 1 if and only if x shaves y, right? Can you imagine this? So every row, you get a matrix out of this function f. Every row corresponds to a man, and every column corresponds to a man as well. Okay. But given the theorem, there is a row that does not belong to this matrix, and we can get it by diagonalization. How? we're going to define g of y to be 1 exactly when f of y and y is 0. Now, what does f of y and y mean? Y, whether y shaves himself or not. So, when will g of y be 1? When y does not shave himself. And when would it be 0? When y shaves himself. So this new function corresponds to a man who shaves exactly those men who do not shave themselves. Yeah, but this is no man because he's not one of the rows. Because the rows correspond to all men. Right? So you cannot have this barber. This barber is not one of the men, right? Could be a woman, maybe, but not one of the men. Now another, let's say, Russell's paradox. Remember, Russell defined the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. So once again, you can show this by the diagonalization arguments. Let's take A to be the set of all sets. All right? And B, again, be a set containing 0 and 1. And we will define f of x and y to be 1 if and only if y belongs to x. All right? So imagine every row corresponds to a set, and every column corresponds to a set. When would you have a 0? If this set is not a member of this one. When would it be a 1? If it is a member. All right? But given the theorem, there is a row that we can construct which is different from all the rows that we have, and we will construct it exactly by doing what? By flipping the bit at the diagonal. All right? But what would this function g represent? The set of all things which are not members of themselves. Yeah, but this is not among our list of sets, so it's not a set. Right? Yeah. The axiom of comprehension? I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know. Which says what? Can you tell me?
So given an infinite family, you can choose a number. There is a set which contains a number from different. You can choose.
You can choose?
Because you need a criterion to choose from infinitely many sets.
Uh-huh.
Because the paradox itself reveals that x given such that p of x does not necessarily define a set.
Right.
So if I'm unsure if that theorem is
The original theorem.
yes, the a cross a to
Yeah.
b remains true for the infinite set. I have no idea.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure either. Yeah.
Because these become tricky very quickly.
Absolutely. You see it? Okay. Yeah, this is not a set. Yeah. No, neither. We're just showing that this kind of thing is not one of the sets. I mean, whatever it is not one of the sets that we have. But we kind of intuitively think that this should be a set, right? And there you get the paradox, or you get the contradiction. All right. So what can we do with these things? Are they useful, actually? Yeah, sometimes they are. The techniques that we saw can be used to prove interesting stuff. I'll just show you two famous examples. Now, the first one, of course, is the proof that the set of real numbers is uncountable. And just assume that it is countable, which means that you can list the real numbers, the first real number, the second real number, and so on. We can just restrict ourselves to the real numbers within the interval from 0 to 1. If we show that this is uncountable, that's enough. Why? Because I just don't need to worry about what happens before the decimal point. So take A to be the set of natural numbers. the subscript over here, the order of the real number in the enumeration, and take b to be the set of decimal digits from 0 to 9. And then the function f of n and m would be the nth digit of the nth number, right? So m is on the column and n is in the row. So each row would represent a real number, all right? And then the function basically means it's the nth digit of the nth number. Then we take the same construction of g that we had before, all right, where we define g of m to be, take a diagonal element in the mth row, and then add 1 to it modulo 10, all right? Then what do you get? You get something which is not in that sequence, right? But that's a contradiction because we assume that the sequence contains all the real numbers, but we just constructed one, which was not there. So our assumption that there is such a sequence must be then wrong. The other example has to do with computer programs. So is there a program which, given the source code, and I'm going to refer to the source code of a program by the program between angle brackets. So given the source code of some program P, will return true if P loops forever on its own code, right? So this program P will take a string as input, might loop forever or not, okay, on any input string. Now, the question is, can we construct a program that we will give it the code of a program, and we'll do whatever it needs. We'll look at it, right, analyze it, whatever it is, and we'll decide whether this program will loop forever if you feed it its own code as input, all right? So, suppose that A is the set of all programs that we can ever write, all of them. And B is again the set containing 0 and 1. Now we define f of x and y, right? X and y are programs, to be 1 exactly if x halts when you give it the code of y as input. All right? Fair enough? Then we define g of y as usual by changing the diagonal. Okay? So g of y is 1 exactly when f of y and y is 0. When would f of y and y be 0? If y halts, does not loop forever on its own code. And when would it be 1? If it does, right? So this, if y loops forever on its own code, and it will be 1, it will be 0 if it does not, okay? So this is the program that we want, that we're asking about. So you'll give it something, and it will return true if that program loops forever on its own code, otherwise it will return false. But that thing that we just constructed is not one of the programs, right? It's different from all of them. So it's not a program. Yep? What do you mean by subset? Reducible? Similar to it? I cannot say that all of them are like that, but many of them have some common elements. I mean, most of these problems have something in common. And the idea of this theorem is just one way to express what's in common between them. There are other ways to try to do that. Okay, this is a paradox. Why? Because this is the last slide in this talk, right? So, thank you very much for coming. And if you have questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to. Thank you.